Welcome to the Dog Trainers Podcast, a podcast created by dog trainers, for dog trainers, or anyone who's ever fallen in love with man's best friend.
Episode 11, A Deeper Look, Positive Reinforcement Training. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to the Dog Trainers Podcast. We're happy to have you back. This is episode 11, A Deeper Look, Positive Reinforcement Training. I'm Mariano, that's Brent. You can find us at our Instagram pages. Mine is UNTAMEDDOGCO, that's all one word, and Brent is CANISBEHAVIor, again, all one word. So we're excited to have you guys here today. We really want to dissect this and give a more kind of clear understanding from a dog trainer's perspective of what exactly positive reinforcement training is. And with that, I'm going to kick it over to you, Brent.
Cool. Thanks, man. How you been? I miss you.
Pretty good. How are you? I miss you too, man.
I miss you. I wish you didn't live in Arizona all the time. I wish you could come and visit me more.
Is it weird that when we both said I miss you together? And so I was thinking of that song, Kiss Me Through the Phone.
That was a little weird. Kiss me through the phone. Something. Let's get back to work. Anyway.
All right.
Hey, everybody. All right. So today we are talking about positive reinforcement training. As you guys know, me and Mariano, we've been able to work a lot with multidiscipline approaches of dog training. We're huge believers that every dog trainer should definitely be masters of certain fields and philosophies of dog training, but definitely we need to understand and respect all the other formats of dog training. And I think one of the ones that really come up a lot, we hear it all over social media, we hear it all over the dog community, is positive reinforcement training. However, over the last 15, 20 years, the word positive reinforcement has kind of turned into more of a marketing slogan and less of the actual learning theory science that it originated from. So what we want to start off with, let's go ahead and just start off breaking down exactly what positive reinforcement is for those of you guys who it might be unfamiliar to you, because funny enough, it may actually be something slightly different than you thought. Okay. So we talked about this in a couple other podcasts where we talked about B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner is the founder, the godfather of behaviorism, which pretty much was the theory that every living creature learns based off of 4 variables, right? It's things that we get. We work for things that are desirable and we work to avoid things that are undesirable. And so pretty much he broke down the 4 quadrants of operant conditioning. One of these quadrants is positive reinforcement. But just to break it down, positive reinforcement is one quadrant, negative reinforcement is another, positive punishment and negative punishment are all 4 quadrants. Now we won't get into the other ones in depth because we're just going to talk about positive reinforcement. But in the original learning theory science, the word positive did not mean to feel good, right? It didn't have this feel good connotation. The word positive literally meant what it means in mathematics, which is to add something to the equation. Now, the word reinforcement means to increase the likelihood that a behavior will happen again in the future, right? So if we reinforce a behavior, we're making sure that the learner understands that should happen again next time, right? So pretty much we are adding something to an equation in order to reinforce to make sure that it happens again. So in essence, in dog training, this is known as the common reward or the common treat, or just the common praise. We're marking that moment in time the dog does something well, and we use motivation as the reinforcer, so that way the dog learns, if I do that behavior again, I get that reinforcer again. Okay. So this is what it meant in science theory. However, over the years, the terminology has kind of been shifted to mean other things. So Mariano, would you mind chiming in a little bit? What do you feel that over the years that the word positive reinforcement has been perceived as by the public?
Yeah, so positive reinforcement has largely become, in the public's eyes, a way to never say no to your dog and never, as someone would see it, never be mean to your dog. And so we talk about positive and negative, as you just said, in a scientific sense, as in I'm adding or taking something away. Most people these days tend to think of positive reinforcement as you're being nice. I'm being positive as opposed to being negative. I'm not being like a Debbie Downer. So one big thing that I notice with positive reinforcement in kind of today's culture is it tends to fall in line a lot with other ideals that we have. And it comes from a good place. I actually just spoke to someone on the phone earlier today, and regarding dog training. And it really comes from an understandable place of, I don't want to do something to my dog that could be perceived as negative.
Right.
And we can understand that wholeheartedly. I think, though, a larger issue from a dog training perspective, and when we did talk about this previously, it was episode 9, I believe, um, responding to the Stuff You Should Know podcast.
Hmm.
It I think a lot of it just stems from people have this idea or this tendency to kind of overhumanize their dogs, and they see, or yeah, overhumanize their dogs. Sorry, and they kind of see their dogs through a lens that's a little bit too human, to the point to where it becomes a bit of a detriment to the dogs, or at least it can.
Right. Right. And I mean, I would even challenge the humanization of dogs, because if you were going to humanize a dog, humans, we learn from positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, and negative punishment. That's how we learn as a living species, you know?
I agree in reality, but in my experience, most people that feel this way, like pure positive about their dogs, tend
Mhm.
to feel this way about humans as well.
Got it. Got it. Got it. Got it. Yeah, and I can understand that. I think as a human, we put ourselves as the guardian and as the caretaker of this helpless animal, right?
Right.
So it's kind of like with a kid, right? We're going to be more protected with a kid, but versus an employee or someone that might work for you, or maybe a spouse or a boyfriend or girlfriend, we have no problem letting them know what we want and what we don't like from them, So, but definitely when we're put in a caretaker position over a helpless creature, uh, the desire to treat it fairly, to treat it right, all of that is going to be there. However, we've seen in some scenario, we'll talk about this a little bit later in the podcast, how uh, there are some downfalls to positive reinforcement training, that can actually have a lifelong, that can cause damage to a dog's life, actually, and not directly, indirectly. Um, okay, so what were you gonna say? Were you gonna say something?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to add really quickly for people listening, I don't necessarily think that there's downfalls to positive reinforcement training in and of itself. The problem is Brent's talking about what people perceive positive reinforcement training to be.
Right.
How that's kind of been a little bit askew from what reality is, that
Mhm.
has downfalls of 100%. And I
Yeah.
think that a lot of it, again, I just thought of an example that kind of helps like iterate my point about people when they're put in a caretaker position, they want good things. They want to take care of the animal, but the problem is that they do it in a way that isn't conducive to the animal.
Mhm.
Whereas when people take care of like horses or like farm animals, they know what they need. No one feels bad because a horse is in a stable or because a horse eats hay, or
Right,
because they
right, right.
understand
Good
this is
point.
what a horse needs. But when it comes to dogs, that's what I mean by they humanize them too much.
Right.
Dogs can live a very healthy life when given exactly what a dog needs to thrive, but people have kind of turned it into this like, let me not be mean to him, let me only shelter him from negative experiences, because that's going to ultimately lead to the highest quality of life possible for him.
Right, right, and that's anthropomorphizing a dog, right? So in essence, putting human emotions and experiences on an animal who is not a human,
Right.
and treating them that way, right? So yeah, totally get it, totally get it. I think one thing that came to my mind right now, so positive reinforcement training in the public's eye has kind of been turned into um, food work. Like if you use food and you use exclusively food or praise, that this tends to make you a positive reinforcement trainer. So I guess I want to give a couple examples of positive reinforcement techniques, right? Those of you guys who may have dabbled in it or may not have known what it is. Here we go. So obviously food work is part of it. Using food as a lure, using food to help shape and reward behaviors. This is the number one place that we start in any positive reinforcement work. Okay. We also use food in positive reinforcement work to develop patience, to develop self control. In essence, we use food as a way to motivate the dog to wait certain 1 second durations, 3 second durations, 5 second durations before getting another reward, right? So we get the dog to anticipate a rewarding process so that they learn to wait their turn or be patient. And we see it works really, really well with young puppies. We see it really work really, really well when there's not a lot of distractions. So it is definitely one of the best ways to shape behaviors. Other ways that people might use food, they might use it for developing targets, right? And also we can use food to actually associate positive meanings to things that might be unrelated to the dog. So, for example, like a clicker, a verbal marker. Some people will use targets, as I mentioned, like they'll use poles. Like, I don't know if you guys have ever seen aquatic animals, dolphin training, whale training. They'll actually have targets like on the end of a stick, and they teach the dolphin, if they tap it with their nose, then they get a fish for it, right? So positive reinforcement work has a lot of different uses. And I do agree in that it is one of the best ways for starting to shape new behaviors, right? Because what I've learned over the years is listening in the way that we want dogs to listen is not really a natural thing for most dogs, let alone animals in general, right? So teaching a dog to heel, like dogs don't heel in the wild, or they don't heel out of instinct. So there's a lot of things that we are teaching the dogs that are very specifically based on our human experience and our human life with them.
Yeah, and it's funny, the way that we typically like to explain things in terms of dog training to a client is it's our job to understand where the dog is coming from, but also understand where you're coming from and kind of meet you guys in the middle and come to some sort of understanding. So dog training a lot of times can feel like a liaison,
Mm-hmm.
and when we talk about dogs don't heel in the wild. Dogs don't, really care much about sitting and laying down on command in the wild. So the reason why positive reinforcement has such an important place in training dogs, because I agree with you that it's definitely one of the most efficient, most effective ways of shaping new behaviors, is when we talk about dog training overall, or we talk about just dog behavior overall. Dogs who aren't in the wild, they're living in domestic settings and they're having to live by rules that aren't necessarily like innately understood by dogs because they
Mm-hmm.
just weren't formulated with them in mind. They have certain tendencies, certain urges that don't make sense all the time, like barking at the mailman, chasing a
Yeah.
squirrel. And so, what we're dealing with there, these things that no one had to teach the dog. No one teaches dogs to bark at them. Oh, maybe someone does, but most people don't teach dogs to bark at the mailman.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Dogs do it because it's an internal drive. It's something that they already love. And dogs don't naturally just love sitting and laying down, but
Mm-hmm.
with work, you can incentivize these things and you can make a cue, like you were saying. It could be a marker, be it a clicker or a word, and you reward when they do these things. You build incentive, you build work ethic.
Mm-hmm.
These things can become valuable. It can become rivalrous
Mm-hmm.
to going after the mailman. So it can be like bark, bark, bark. No, 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 come, sit down, stay. And the
Exactly.
dog goes, oh, sure, I'll take it, because it's just as valuable, if not more.
Yeah, yeah. And I think in positive reinforcement, the biggest thing here is, and we will do another video in higher forms of motivation work, but usually we have to find something that the dog really loves. And sometimes dogs like food, and sometimes dogs don't like food. So we might have to find a different motivator. It could be a toy, it could be a squeaker. But then there is also something that comes up that's called real life rewards, right? The dog human experience and the dog owner experience. There are so many points in a dog's life where, like in the dog's day to day, where we are rewarding them without necessarily knowing, right? So when we feed them their breakfast, that's technically a reward, right? When we go for that walk, that's technically a reward. When we let them jump on the couch and give them belly rubs, that's technically could be used as a motivational tool, right? So there's all these little things that we just do as humans who own dogs and hang out with dogs on a regular basis, that sometimes what we see is people aren't leveraging some of the other types of rewards, and they tend to only focus on food, right? And the issue with that is not always is food on a person, right, to be able to reward those things. So cool. So we went over a couple of different ways that food is used. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the bad practices that we see in food work. Because just like any tool in dog training, when you start with the tool, that's very powerful, right? So food is a very powerful tool. Leashes are
Hmm.
very powerful tools. Training collars are very powerful tools. The whole idea is that these tools are to sustain the dog's focus in the learning process. Then our end goal should always be figuring out a way to phase those tools, the necessity for those tools out, once the
Hmm.
behavior has actually been conditioned strong enough and properly enough, right? So one of the big issues and complaints I hear, maybe you can relate to this, is my dog won't listen unless I have a treat in my hand.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
all the time.
that's a huge one. That's a huge one. And so, as dog trainers, we learn something called a reinforcement schedule, and we learn phasing out of food, and we phasing out of lures, phasing out of tools, and this idea of phasing things out, or abbreviating concepts. But the average dog owner doesn't, right? And if
Hmm.
you might go to other corporate stores, that do dog training, it's not necessarily in their benefit for them to teach you how to phase food out, because then you'll stop buying treats, right? It's not necessarily, um, eh, uh, a completely understood, idea from some dog trainers who do use food, right? Because in an essence, that food is so powerful. How do we gradually work our way to give up that power? The answer is reinforcement schedules, right?
Right.
So I guess to give you guys some examples, or sorry, we'll go into reinforcement schedules a little later. Any other bad practices that you might see with food, Mariano?
Um, a big practice that I see done wrong with food is people use food maybe a little too much.
Yeah,
You ever seen that happen? The dogs kind of lose interest. I see this a lot at at like a PetSmart or a Petco style training class. And I'm not slamming. The only reason I see this there is because I work with
they primarily work. Yeah, do that.
right. Well, and I'm there because I work with various rescues and we have like adoption events there. So nothing against Petco trainers. It's just it's a good idea. Positive reinforcement training obviously has its place. It is definitely one of the best, if not the best, most effective way of shaping behavior, as we've said. But when you're working a dog, I do notice this. For a trainer, maybe it's not such a big deal because we have workarounds to this kind of thing that we've had to develop over time.
Hmm.
But as the dogs get more and more satiated, right, a little further down, like the lesson, let's say 5, 6, 7 minutes in, the dog's eaten already and they're just not that hungry anymore.
Hmm.
The motivation levels drop a little bit, or at least the motivation levels for the food drop a little bit. And so I'll see a dog in a group class setting sitting for like a while, and then 20 minutes later he's just pulling, trying to play with the dog next to him, and the mom is like here, 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 with a waving a treat in his face, and he could care less.
Hmm.
And so she's just trying to like feed him to the point to where, and I'm like, that has a shelf life. You can't just feed him forever. He's going to care less and less about it because it's it's losing context of being a reward, and now it's just something that's just here all the time.
Yeah, yeah. It's almost like it stops being a reward. It almost starts becoming a bribe. You know.
Yeah, well, and it stops being a clear marker at
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
So me and you have talked about this, before we ever even started this podcast, and you put it to me perfectly. You told me my favorite definition of spoiling a dog was you reward them when they're good, you reward them when they're bad. And if a dog is pulling in some other direction or not giving you the proper attention or whatever it is that you're asking for at the time and you're rewarding, your rewards lose value as rewards.
Yeah, yeah,
Now
or
they're just things that the dog
it's hard to
gets.
differ. The line gets super blurred,
Right.
what the right behavior is. Yeah.
Right. And I think that as far as food work goes, I'm sure you can agree, just as important as knowing how to best motivate the dog, like we've talked about before, finding the best treat or the best toy or whatever it is that really motivates the dog more so than things that are just kind of so so.
Hmm.
Timing, really making sure that the dog is crystal clear about what you want, then they can repeat what it is consistently and then really kind of hone it and make it a part of their muscle memory.
Yes. Yes. Timing is so important. I was actually going to say that before you mentioned the word, but yeah, timing is definitely a thing we see very badly done with novice food trainers or people who are learning food work. And their trainers need to make sure that they understand timing really, really well, right? And it's interesting because with positive reinforcement training, we have to make sure that we are hitting the same moments in time consistently and that we're rewarding with proper timing, because it's very easy to accidentally reward the dog for barking, or it's very easy to accidentally reward the dog for sitting up or for standing up after you told them to sit, right? And so it's timing and also specification for what is getting rewarded. We tend to see a little bit of weak areas in there for sure. Let's see. So we went over relying on food too much, not phasing out.
Hmm.
We went over bad
Hmm.
timing. What else? What else can we think of in bad practices of positive reinforcement training?
Here's a bad, I don't know if this counts as a bad practice, or maybe it does. When when either one of these things goes wrong that we just talked about, and so the dog isn't listening, people kind of tend to give up, or at least in my opinion, it's kind of a bad practice for people to say, all right, you know what, he's a little too distracted, we'll just do it again like further or later, or.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so the dog never quite gets pushed to that level. And of course, I want this
Right.
to be understood in proper, dog training understanding of, yes, work the dog up to that point to where they can understandably do what you're asking them to do in the current distraction.
Right.
But also, if you get them there and they can, and they're just being distracted for whatever reason, you just kind of throw your hands up in the air, you're going to start to hit roadblocks at some point.
Right. Actually, that brings me up to another bad practice that came into my mind. Another bad practice is people underestimate how much practice actually needs to happen with positive reinforcement training. Like how
Hmm.
many repetitions, especially if we start dealing with a dog who checks out often, right? A very distractible puppy or a very distracted dog. People will lose faith in the method because they don't understand how many repetitions need to be stacked back and back to back to back to back, right? There have been times where I've had a dog training session and this dog, likes their kibble, for example. And I put, let's say, 1.5 cups of kibble in a bowl, right? And every round or repetition is a single kibble reward,
Yeah, one kibble. Yeah.
one kibble. Well, guess what? That whole training session, I fed that
Hmm.
dog over 200 kibbles, or maybe like 100, over 100 kibbles for sure. But we did 100 repetitions of whatever I was working on at that time in order to get that result. Right. And so what people, and sometimes what's not taught is if you have a dog who is very distractible or who just keeps checking out or just doesn't happen to get it, that timing and that realization of how engaging you need to make food work in order for those dogs to really stay with it, especially if you're doing a group class style, especially if you're in a distracting environment, which I think would also be that would also be something I would add to the list as well of bad practices. Practicing in an environment that's too distracting for the dog.
Hmm.
That would definitely be one. You know.
So,
Go ahead.
as I hear us both dissecting this, would you agree to this statement? Positive reinforcement training is one of the best, most effective ways of shaping new behaviors in a dog, but is one of the most poorly executed on
Yeah.
average.
Yeah. 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 I would say that it's more. It's more most pure. It's yeah. What did you say? The most
It's
poorly executed. Yes.
Yeah, and maybe a lot of that just has to do with the fact that it's the most popular currently. So if more people are doing it, more people are going to mess it up because it's just a numbers game at that point.
True.
But
But also it's a timing thing. It is a
oh
timing.
yeah,
Yeah. A lot of timing is, and I think that across the board of all dog training methods or philosophies, timing is super important, right? Things will work if you have the if you pay attention and hit the nail on the head, right? Um, but yeah, timing is a big thing, and I think across all dog training methods, controlling your distraction level is going to be a big one.
yeah, and controlling the dog's excitement level is going to be a big factor as to how distracted they can get or how distracting the environment can be without the dog getting too overwhelmed.
Yes.
So I definitely agree that timing is huge regardless of method.
Hmm.
And it's just, I don't want to beat the dead horse, but since we're taking the time, I want to make sure whoever's listening, the reason why timing is absolutely paramount is because regardless of the dog training methodology that you're planning to use to train your dog or your client's dog, if the dog cannot completely build that correlation between your action and their reaction or vice versa, they're not going to know how to either do more or do less of this thing that they're getting corrected or rewarded for.
Right.
So they need to completely understand exactly what it is that you're doing in direct response to what they're doing.
Right. So we talked about some bad practices. Let's list them real quick. Sometimes people rely on food too much. They don't phase that out. What else did we say? We said timing is an issue.
Hmm.
We say people underestimate how much conditioning and practice actually needs to be put into positive reinforcement work in order for it to work.
Hmm.
People also underestimate the distraction levels of the learning environment, right? So if I have a very distractible dog and I'm trying to train him outside at the park, it's going to be really difficult, right? Start training them in the kitchen, or start training them somewhere where it's a little bit quieter, where you're going to have a higher success rate. Because the key with positive reinforcement, if you find yourself having to constantly lure or bribe the dog with food to just look at you for 1 second, then that tells us, that is a telltale sign that the environment is too distracting for that puppy at that stage. Okay.
Right.
So let's go into some good practices. In essence, so let's just talk about the antithesis of those bad practices. So we're going to go ahead and talk about reinforcement schedules. So there's 4 types of reinforcement schedules that we have to play with in dog training in order to be able to completely phase food out as the main source of the dog's listening. Right. So, for example, there's fixed ratio and variable ratio. The word fixed just means that it's the same every single time, and variable means that it fluctuates in quantity or number every single time. Right. So, for example, an example for that would be every position change or every command my dog does, he gets 1 treat, or every command that he gets is 2 treats. Right. So this is called a fixed ratio. A variable ratio would look like this. Every command my dog might get 1 treat. Then the second one, my dog might get 4 treats. Then the third one, my dog might get 6 treats. Then my dog might get no treats on the next one, right? So those are variable ratios. Okay. Now there's fixed interval and there's variable interval. Now, when we're talking about interval, we're talking about time. So how much time goes in between before my dog gets a reward or a reinforcer. So fixed interval pretty much means every 2 seconds, my dog gets a treat. Every 3 seconds, my dog gets a treat. So it's fixed. That time does not change or fluctuate. Variable, on the other hand, it fluctuates all the time. I might treat my dog after 3 seconds of staying, then I wait 10 seconds to stay, then I treat the dog at 7 seconds of staying, then I treat the dogs at 15 seconds of staying. So variable interval is how, in essence, we can develop endurance, and in essence, I like to call it the faith rule. The dog develops faith that he might get food if he waits long enough, right? So these are the 4 ways that we do it, and we play with these different ratios, and we play with these different intervals to motivate the dog in different directions. Now, the reason that there's 4 is there's different personalities that are going to lean towards one over the other. There are some dogs who like consistency, so we have to give them a fixed ratio. Now, that can change. The dog can get a treat. The dog can get 1 treat for every command, or the dog can get 5 treats for every command. It depends on what the dog finds to be the most rewarding. But when we start going into intervals, I might say, my dog needs to do 3 commands for 1 treat. So however long it takes my dog to do 3 commands, he gets 1 treat. My dog might have to do 5 commands for 1 treat, right? And usually when we're doing fixed interval and variable intervals, this is where we start developing more patience and engagement in the process of food. When we're trying to develop drive and focus, then we start using the fixed ratio and the variable ratio. Okay. So I don't think we have enough time exactly how to implement these things in an actual training process. But here's a very simple description. In food work, what we can do is we can just start by, if I'm treating my dog for every single thing that he does, sit, treat, down, treat, come, treat, down, treat. What we can start doing is we can start creating 2-step sequences. So come and sit, gets a cookie. Come and down, gets a cookie. Sit and down, gets a cookie. So 2 steps gets a cookie. Then what we can do is we can turn that into 3. So then we can go 1, come to me, sit down, now lay down. That gets a treat. Then we can say, come to me, lay down, sit down, and then lay down again, right? And get a treat, right? So the idea is we start asking the dog to do more things for less rewards, right? But sometimes, depending, if you haven't developed strong focus on your dog, you'll lose the dog's interest. So working a lot with fixed ratio is really, really important up front in food training. Once your dog likes the games and is very, very focused, then we can start asking more commands or more obedience for less rewards. And little by little, we can start phasing those out by changing turning it into a variable interval of reinforcement.
I couldn't agree more. That's a great description. So let me add a little something to it.
Yeah.
With all this understanding of what exactly you just said,
Mm-hmm.
And I was hoping you were going to bring it up. I was thinking of it in my head, like ready to dive in, but you got it perfectly. Of my
Nice.
dog can do several repetitions before you give him a treat. Maybe sit down, sit again, treat, and so on. Now, what you were talking about just now was it definitely takes a certain level of understanding of how to up your engagement if you're going to be sparsing out the treats. And a great way to do that, again, is to understand that markers aren't just for definitive commands. And what I mean by that is, let's say when I'm first teaching a dog to sit,
Mm-hmm.
I'll offer the command, sit, reinforce with the food. Dog sits down. The moment their little butt hits the ground, you release, right? To mark the behavior.
Mm-hmm.
It's okay, or it's break, or good, or yes, whatever it is that you decide. For me, I use break.
Mm-hmm.
So just as an example, as soon as the dog's little butt hits the ground, break, and then the dog gets food. And because I've associated the word break like a clicker, they understand, oh, that means it's mine now.
Right. You've charged it.
So
You've charged the
correct.
break. Yep.
Now, you can charge words other than the release. So if I'm going to be asking for a bigger sequence of commands, it's not going to be like sit, break, down, break. It's going to be like sit down, come, sit down, and then release and then reward. So the way to keep a dog motivated through those things, especially if we're going to be having them wait in between, like sit, 10 seconds down, 10 seconds, is you can still mark with charged, markers that don't mean you're free to go. And the word that I use is good, and I think you use yes a lot. And, so it can be like sit, good, down, good, come, good boy, sit, good. And you can
Mm-hmm.
keep them engaged to a certain extent because it's another marker, and it means with the context that I give it when I'm training a dog, it means you're on the way, you're just not there yet. So it's a great thing to keep in mind. Definitely keep your markers consistent, not only for the actual definitive like beginning or end of a command, but
Mm-hmm.
even in the middle. Good, 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 and let them know that you're still there, you're still aware that they're still there, and that they're heading in the right direction.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. Um, for those of you guys who are interested in learning a little bit more about marker trainings in essence can start replacing the need for treats, as Mariano is leading to. So,
Hmm.
so if our dogs can get a positive feedback from us or an affirmative feedback, then without having to get a treat, we can still at least let the dog know they're on the right track and to keep going until they're done. And once the dog gets to the very end of the sequence, boom, the dog gets their reward that they've been waiting for. So when you master food work, you should be able to get your dog to do sequences of things for a simple treat reward, right? Or a simple pat on the head or a simple throwing of the ball or, cuddle session, right? So that's the whole goal. Very nice. Very great. I'm so glad you added that to the mix. Let's see. So we talked about how to phase food out. We talked
Hmm.
about timing, right? We talked about timing. Um, any thoughts you have on timing?
Well, that's kind of what I was getting at, was the proper timing of everything. Make sure that you mark things appropriately. That is timing,
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah,
right?
you're right.
Marking things out. No, 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 you're good. I'm just
You're
I'm
right.
just clarifying for people listening so that because if I just want to make sure that that point is made. I want to ask you something though before we move on.
Yeah, go ahead.
So we're talking about how to correct, how to be the antithesis of what we see done wrong.
Hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about, as we go through the motions, all the repetitions, especially like you said, working a puppy with kibble, and it can take a while with all the little kibbles. One thing that I notice that I like a lot when you and I do puppy sessions whenever we can together is you've really got a good handle on how to up your engagement as the dog's food motivation goes down because they're getting full throughout a lesson.
Right. Right. I think one big skill that I learned from one of my mentors was the importance of your energy and engagement. One thing he taught me was you create the energy that you want to have in the session. So a lot of times, if the handler is, I guess for lack of a better term, boring or like mechanical, where they're just like kind of low energy, good dog, give a treat, sit,
Hmm.
good dog, lay down, good dog. What ends up happening, unless that dog is really excited for food, you're going to lose that dog's attention very quickly. So, definitely in positive reinforcement training, movement is super important. Making sure you have a high value treat is really important, but also the energy you bring to that session. So if you're acting playful, if you're acting fun, if you're acting excited, guess what you're going to create in that dog? The dog will almost mirror those behaviors. If we are absent of those positive or engaging feelings, then unfortunately the dog gets bored, they check out, they're not having fun. So very easily, it doesn't matter how high value of a treat you have, you can actually, the session can be cut short because pretty much the dog isn't having fun, right? Yeah.
Or the dog can be confused if you're not quite clear enough. I see this a lot when you're working with, a client, let's say, or I'm working with a client.
Mm-hmm.
They're bringing energy, and I like it. I like the energy that I see.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe they're working, let's say, a sit, and they're doing small things wrong. The food's a little too far from the dog, or they move too fast, and so the food's just kind of gone.
Mm-hmm.
In those little circumstances, I've seen dogs that will work for food, but they're only like motivated to a point. So if it's not right here, that you won't
Yeah.
get the smooth reps out of them.
Yeah.
So sometimes just fixing those tiny little things in your training will really allow you to get those extra few reps out of a dog, which over the course of a training program, if you're bored in training, I mean, we're talking a significant amount of repetitions and a significant amount of rewards and
Yep.
deeper understanding overall. And I think it's just important to keep that in mind.
Yeah. 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 100%. I was looking at, so just going back to the list of things that we wanted to antithesis.
Mm-hmm.
So you talked about timing. I will say marker training and just like getting used to markers, it freaking helps timing as a dog trainer, as a dog owner. Learning marker work is the best for all timing. It allows you to see the little nuances of behavior that maybe you didn't see before. And also, one thing I love about positive reinforcement and marker training is that sometimes you mark close approximations of a behavior, right? So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
the other day I had a session online with a client, and they said, they've tried all these different YouTube channels and stuff like that, and they couldn't get their dog to lay down. It literally took us a whole week to get the dog to lay down with a hand signal. And we had to do a couple of different close approximation rewards, right? So we would reward the dog for putting their head low. Then we'd reward the dog for putting their head lower. Then we'd reward the dog for putting their head even lower than that. And so we had to kind of break up the shaping of this down position into 4 stages, right? So that the dog would develop a desire to continue going into that down position. And then we were able to do it, right? We were able to do it. Luckily, we were able to shape it in like a very long session. However, it took about a whole week for them to be able to get the hand signal down, right? So it was a process. But that's one thing I really like about marker training. It will teach you close approximations. It will teach you how to break down shaping behaviors to a more in-depth than maybe just some basic lure reward training would. So I would definitely subscribe to learning marker training.
Yeah.
What was some of the other stuff? We talked about conditioning. Yeah, we talked about conditioning.
Oh,
I
can I
think,
touch on this
yeah, please
really
do.
quick? I'm sorry.
Please do. Yeah, yeah.
So when it comes to conditioning, I completely agree that people tend to underestimate just how important it is or how much you have to do in terms of volume, repetitions to really hone this craft, not only from your perspective, but from the dogs, because they're the ones who need to perform under pressure of whatever the distraction is. So a great thing that I like to do, um, when you're working within your lessons, within each individual lesson, let's say, you're starting a dog very simple. If the dog is in the beginning of their program, let's say a 5-month-old puppy. I just got a call today, 5-month-old puppy, German Shepherd mix. Um, so he's going to be, I can imagine he's going to be pretty easy to food train. When we move on to more advanced forms of training down the line, every now and again, I sneak in a little food lesson here and there. Or when I'm doing online lessons with clients, I'll give them their weekly homework, and one day I'll say, you know what, toss a little food lesson in there and head way back, like week 2 stuff, just drilling sits and downs with food.
Mhm.
And it's just to, even if your dog progresses past this point, and you definitely need to work the higher levels of stuff. So, we've talked about the pyramid before. Foundation's the most important because a pyramid works like, so the
Mhm.
foundation's the biggest. You really drill it, really
Mhm.
hammer it. It's important. It's invaluable for later forms of training. Now,
Mhm.
you still need to actively and directly work these later forms of training, but here and there, sprinkle some foundational stuff in there. I think it pays huge dividends because what ends up happening is the dog gets so focused and so efficient at this later stuff that they get a little sloppy with the basic food stuff.
Yeah.
So you really maximize this kind of like push and pull of the whole thing.
Right. No, I completely agree. I like the idea of sprinkling it in, right? It's just kind of like, like just, throw some veggies in there. It's good for you. It's really, it's important. It's really important. Well, and did you like that? You like that examples? It's one of those things that it's good for you. It helps the dog reconnect with those basic skills that he developed. On my input that I want to give for conditioning, and I tell a lot of clients, if anyone's ever worked with me, they hear me say this. And usually when I'm conditioning, there's always a certain level of productivity I want to get out of the dog. Right. So in my mind, very, very similar to how like a personal trainer might want their client to, okay, we are doing 10 reps of chest presses. Right. With my dogs, I have goals. So I'll say, this session, we're going to do 5 in a row. Right. If that's too much for them, okay, at least we're going to nail 3 perfect ones in a row before this session is done. And so when we work with goals like that, 3 and then 5 in a row and then 10 in a row, right, now conditioning is exponential, right? So within 1 week, it's so easy for me to get over 500 repetitions of a command if I work that way. Right. Versus people won't even do 500 repetitions in a year with their dog on some commands. Right. So conditioning and revisiting it and practicing it and getting the dog to do it in context and out of context. This is where the conditioning really, really comes into play. And that's one thing also, I don't, to kind of your point, to randomly throw in, a food work session. I also like throwing in food work sessions out of context. Right. So like, imagine like, your dog sleeping on the couch and he's just minding his own business. Well, grab some food real quick, throw it in your pocket, tell that dog to come and sit for you. And he's going to be like, but we're not in training mode right now. You just come and sit. Well, the dog's going to come and sit. You give him a treat. Good boy. Let him go back to the couch. 2 seconds later, ask him to come to you. When he comes to you, give him a lot of food. So the cool thing is sometimes you can surprise the dog or sprinkle it in throughout the day where the dog actually looks forward to you randomly asking him to listen to him, right? Or to listen to you. So pretty fun. That was a great tip. What was the last one? We talked about distraction levels, right?
Yes.
Okay. Anything you want to say on distraction levels?
Well, I think in terms of distraction levels, what you just talked about goes a very long way because the dog is always kind of keeping an ear out for you because he wants to earn that reward.
Yeah.
So another thing that I would say to that end is if you're going to be working this is more for our dog trainer friends who are listening to this. You ever notice if you have like a bespoke dog training room, after a few food lessons, you walk into the room, dog's immediately just on, like, all right, here we go. I know what's happening. So I think it's great for you, when you say like not only hit them at various times throughout the day, but do it in different contexts too. Go to the backyard and do some and go here and there and do some. But also, if you're having a hard time motivating a dog for very long, consider making the food lessons shorter and more frequent throughout the day.
Yeah. Good point.
That's a cool way to keep their motivation levels up. And if you're working with a puppy, typically what I'll do if I'm working with a puppy is I'll do breakfast and dinner in the crate so that the dog can start building his potty schedule because we have to teach that too.
Right.
But as far as obedience, I'll do maybe 3 lessons a day and I'll do 2 with food or 2 with food as in treats and then 1 with his meal of lunch, which is his kibble. Just to get the lessons in, but you're not feeding the dog too much extra because one of those meals is his meal.
Right.
But yeah, I just wanted to toss that in there as a little additive for dog trainer friends. If the dog is building a context with that room, which we see that all the time.
Yep. They're like really good just in that room.
Yeah.
Just in that room. Yeah.
Then definitely branch out.
For sure. And I guess in learning environments, one thing that we always want to focus on in positive reinforcement techniques is we want to make sure that the learner has the proper environment to learn in, right? So, just imagine being a kid having to do your homework in the living room with your family watching TV. Like that's hard, right? And so many times in like group classes, this might be the case. Some dogs, they love the food so much, they are honing in and completely focused on that food. But there are some other dogs that they have doggy ADD and they're just bouncing off the walls a little bit. And it's hard to keep them. So in those scenarios, if you find yourself using food as a bribe, a lure that you're constantly have to redirect the dog back to you, try saying, how can we make this environment as undistracting as possible. So sometimes you might have to train in a bathroom with nothing else, right? Or you might have to train in the kitchen with the doors locked, or you might have to train, in the garage where there's nothing, right? Except you, which is the most interesting thing. So those would be some great practices to just kind of balance out those bad practices that a lot of people do. All right. Cool. So next, very last subject we want to talk about. As dog trainers who've been doing this for a very, very long time, we tend to see that certain methodologies, every methodology has its pros and its cons. What do you think some of the cons are of positive reinforcement training?
I think before I get into the cons, I just want to give a little what I consider to be a misconception.
Yeah.
So when we talk about positive reinforcement and that segment of the little, the kind of four quadrants
Yeah.
of food work, in order for there to be positive reinforcement, it's almost impossible to not have a like negative punisher.
Right.
Because denying food, if you're giving food for certain things, you're denying it for certain other things because the dog wants it all the time.
Right.
So with that being said, here's a con as we see it. And I'm going to attribute this not so much to positive reinforcement as a technique, but as it's seen in like modern culture, which isn't exactly the same thing of what it actually is.
Right.
So what people typically think of with pure positive training, you should never say no. You should, if you don't like something, you should ignore it. And I think that there's lots of reasons as to why these won't always work. And if they do, sweet. But if we're talking cons, I don't consider food when we're talking distractions and kind of real world scenarios to be the most effective, the most fail proof, the most safe means of making sure that your dog's going to do what they need to do.
Right. Yep. And because sometimes it's sometimes the distraction has a higher value to the dog than the food does, right?
Right.
It's a competing motivator. It could be that dog, could be that squirrel, could be that skateboard across the street. If that dog really wants it, sometimes that food is second best compared to that thing. So yeah, we'll definitely see that obstacle where food just does not work the way that it was originally planned to in certain scenarios. So definitely opening up different quadrants of the operant conditioning chart that would be recommended actually. Some obstacles that I see that come in with positive reinforcement training is if as balanced dog trainers, we definitely understand that certain types of dogs and certain behaviors actually do need opposition, right? They need to be opposed by you as the handler, as the teacher, as the coach, be it aggression, be it, trying to kill another animal, all these things. But the problem is sometimes I've worked with plenty of dogs who have done so much positive reinforcement work that they don't understand the concept that they could do something wrong. Right. And so I've seen many dogs who get frustrated when there's no reward. I've seen many dogs who get who actually don't know how to tolerate stress, right? They don't know how to take no for an answer or say or deal with the fact that they didn't get what they wanted, or that they couldn't work their way around it. So sometimes when we're dealing, outside of a training room or outside of a session, I've seen dogs not actually be able to have enough patience or to be able to tolerate when things don't go their way, right? How about you? You ever seen stuff like that?
Oh yeah, it's definitely there's probability there for big deficits in their game because I think that that's an excellent point to bring up. Is sometimes dogs don't even know how to deal with stress, and that's kind of what I was alluding to when I was kind of framing it as like actual positive reinforcement is fine because
Mhm.
it doesn't necessarily say that you can't like put a dog under stress. Naturally, you are if you're denying food.
Right.
But what it's become, what people think when they think of positive reinforcement, probably the reason they clicked on this title was because yeah, I'm just keeping it real,
It's
So
true.
like,
Yeah.
so the problem is if a dog doesn't know how to deal with stress, you didn't do that dog a favor.
Right.
Dogs need to know how to deal with stress because this is the real world. And while it's not, I tell people this as a dog trainer, it is my job to stress the dog to a degree
Mhm.
because just training by its very nature requires the dog to unlearn things and learn other things, and
Yeah.
change is stressful for anything.
Yeah. And that's
And
that's what
so,
that's what growing up is. Growing up is
right.
stressful. You know, it's our teachers stress us, our coaches stress us, our parents stress us, our friends stress us. So stress is actually a huge part of learning. And that's where we kind of see potential pure positive training as the way that, the way that it's looked at socially can actually create a huge obstacle in development of the dog. I get it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just, a lot of times you learn so much when things go wrong as well as when things go right.
Right.
And so teaching a dog to deal with stress is, I think, invaluable. And in modern like understandings of positive reinforcement, I don't see, in fact, I do see it because it's in direct opposition to stressing a dog.
Right. Right. Totally agree. Totally agree. So, that's being said, what is our summation of positive reinforcement training?
Our summation or the popular summation?
Let's talk about our summation. Hopefully, we can educate some folks. All right, here we go. Our summation is positive reinforcement is definitely one of the best ways to shape new behaviors and motivate dogs to want to learn new behaviors. That is guaranteed, hands down, no arguing. The way that positive reinforcement is treated in the dog training field versus the way that it's looked at socially, this is where we start running into issues. Common areas that need to be taught by dog trainers or need to be requested to be learned by owners is how to eventually phase food out. That's really important. So if your trainer doesn't know how to phase food out, switch your trainer. Number two, make sure that your trainer teaches you good timing, or you as a trainer make sure you teach proper timing, right? And this could be through marker work, this could be through clicker work. Both of them are marker works, but make sure that you teach the trainer or the parent timing. Number three, make sure that you guys pick the proper learning environment. And also number four, make sure that you guys condition as much as possible. Do not underestimate how much you need to condition. The reason your dog listens to you in the kitchen where you pull the treat out of the cookie jar is because you've conditioned that probably more than you've taught the dog to sit out in the hallway or to sit on the sidewalk. So if you guys are not practicing regularly and conditioning and sprinkling those practices random, in different environments and different learning environments, these are going to be the biggest pitfalls to positive reinforcement training if you don't learn them.
100%. Can I just say before we close this out?
Yeah.
For all of you guys listening, we wanted to give a more foundational understanding and conversation of what positive reinforcement training is, but there's so many kind of subcategories that branch off into more advanced forms of training, and we just want to assure you that we are definitely going to be following up this episode with episodes discussing the pros and cons of various other methods of dog training. So keep that one in mind, because there are lots of things like reward events and different types of timing and different types of motivators and competing motivators and things that you can. We talked about them in the sense that they happen naturally, like dog more interested in squirrel than food. But I just wanted to plant that bug in people's ears that we are going to bring up how you can utilize these things in training in a way that's repeatable and safe.
Yep, 100%. Alrighty, guys. That being said, I want to thank everybody for joining us on episode 11, a deeper look into positive reinforcement training. For those of you guys who have Instagram, go ahead and follow me and Mariano. Mariano is at UNTAMEDDOGCO, and mine is at CANISBEHAVIOR. We'd love it if you guys checked in on us and saw what we were posting. Sometimes we have some cool specials, some cool daily tips of the day. Please check that out. Also, make sure you guys check into our next episodes. We will be dissecting other dog training methods. Also, don't forget, leave a review. We need to have reviews so we can know what to do better, what to keep doing. If you guys like this channel, go ahead and like us and go ahead and leave a comment, because we'd love to know what you guys think about everything. And please subscribe. The more subscribers we have, the more reach that we're going to be able to have with you guys. Any questions that you guys have or comments, you guys can also feel free to email us privately at dogtrainerspodcast@gmail.com. And again, we want to really thank you guys so much for listening, and we will see you guys next time. Take care. Thank you for listening to the Dog Trainers Podcast, a podcast created by dog trainers for dog trainers or anyone who's ever fallen in love with man's best friend.
We'll see you next time.